Hello everyone, I hope that you're all doing well. In the previous video, we talked about the first building block, the demand side. This time, I want to focus on the second building block, which is the supply side of the market. Let's begin. Just as in the case of the demand, when we talk about the supply side of the market, we're going to represent our ideas using a market supply curve. Market supply curve is a curve that shows us a total quantity that suppliers are willing to supply at any given would-be market price. On the left-hand side, I have a mathematical representation of a generic supply curve. Again, as in the case of the demand curve, on the y-axis here, I have the price, and on the x-axis here, I have the quantity. Since we're talking about the supply curve this time, the quantity here basically refers to quantity supplied. As you may realize from the shape of the curve, right, the supply curve is basically upward sloping, which is the opposite of the demand curve, which was downward sloping. Upward sloping curve basically means that as the price goes up, right, the total quantity that suppliers are willing to supply increase as well. So why is that? I want to explain the idea behind the upward sloping supply curve using a simple exercise. Actually, before COVID-19, we used to do this as a full case in the class, but with our new circumstances, instead of doing the full case, let me now just summarize you the case and give you the punchline. So I happen to have detailed data about the cost and the production levels of all aluminum producers worldwide. Apparently, there are about 160 aluminum producers worldwide, and interestingly, there is a significant variation across their efficiency levels, meaning that their cost levels. There are some firms that are extremely efficient, so-called low-cost firms. They're able to produce aluminum at a cost that is as low as 800 pounds. This is per ton. And there are also some firms that are extremely inefficient, which are able to produce almost the same aluminum at a cost of 15,000. And there are also a lot of firms which are in the medium range, and their costs vary between 5,000 to 10,000. So this is the information given to you. Then the question is, what would supply curve look like for the aluminum industry? So how do we think about this? The way to think about it is very simple. So we need to basically ask ourselves, right, what would be the total quantity supplied at any given would-be market price? We're going to do a sequence of simple thought experiments. Let's begin with a low price point. Let's suppose that the market price was very low, say less than 800 pounds per ton. How many firms, which of these firms will be willing to supply at such a low price point? The answer should be none of them, right? Even the low-cost firms, the very efficient ones, they're unable to uncover their costs at such a low price points, so therefore they wouldn't be willing to supply. And if they're not willing to supply, then of course the remaining wouldn't be willing to supply neither. So if the price goes up to 1,000, right? Now the price goes up a little bit. So how would the supply decisions will change? Now let's look at it again. At the price of 1,000, which firms will be willing to supply? Now if you look at the cost information here, we realize that now at the price of 1,000, the low-cost firms might actually be willing to supply. And it's only them who will be willing to supply at that price points. So at the price of 1,000, then the total quantity supplied in this market is the total quantity that are supplied by low-cost firms. How about when the price goes up to 10,000, right? That's a pretty big jump. So how will that change? Well, at the price of 10,000, well, the low-cost firms are still willing to supply, right? They're going to make a huge profit actually. And in addition to that, now some of these medium-cost firms, because now they're able to cover their costs, they're willing to supply as well. So therefore, the total quantity supplied in the market would increase substantially. So we can do this kind of thought experiment for various different price points, and then we can look at the quantity supplied at any given price point, right? And once we have these combinations of prices and quantities, we can plot them and obtain the supply curve. And in fact, this is exactly what this exercise was about. And most of the students were doing a pretty good job in obtaining the supply curve. So this is the real supply curve for the aluminum industry. So let's look at the supply curve. Just as in my generic example, right, it is an upward sloping curve. As the price goes up, the total quantities that are willing to be supplied by the suppliers in this market is increasing. It's an upward sloping function. An interesting observation is that initially, right, the supply curve looks fairly flat, meaning that if you look at it, even if I get a tiny little bit of a change, increase in price, there is a huge quantitative response. However, as the industry grows more and more, right, the supply curve becomes quite vertical, meaning that it becomes quite inelastic. So at that price point, for instance, right, when the price even doubles, it goes from 15,000 to nearly 3,000, let's say, the quantity doesn't really respond much to it. So the supply becomes quite inelastic. So I will come back to this. A key concept in supply analysis is the price elasticity of supply. Price elasticity of supply tells us how much the supply side of the market responds to changes in market prices. Formally, we define it as follows. Price elasticity of supply is equal to the percentage change in supply divided by the percentage change in price. If price elasticity of supply is greater than 1, then as a rule of thumb, we will say supply is price elastic. And if this price elasticity of supply is less than 1, then we will call the supply function to be price inelastic. Next, I want to talk about the economic factors that influence the price elasticity of supply. First, capacity constraints. In a market with rising prices, firms generally have a strong incentive to increase their production level, right? At the end of the day, which firm doesn't like higher prices? However, if the firm is facing binding capacity constraints, even if the prices are increasing, the firms may not be in a position to respond to that. And this, you can see, will generate an inelastic supply curve. A related idea is the barriers to entry. Again, let's consider a market with rising prices. Markets with rising prices will attract new players. And when new players come into the market, they will increase the supply. However, if there are barriers to entry, because the new players are not going to be able to come into the market as a response to that price increase, this will inherently reduce the price elasticity of supply. Third, a key factor that influences the price elasticity of supply is the way in which per unit costs change with the total output levels for a given firm. This is basically the scale effects. In economics, we have two scale effects: economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. Economies of scale is basically the case in which per unit cost for a given firm will decline with total output levels. This basically, in plain English, basically means that the firm is becoming more efficient as it produces more and more. Diseconomies of scale, as the name suggests, it is the complete opposite, meaning that the per unit cost this time is actually increasing as the firm is growing and producing more. You can see that the scale effects are inherently linked to the price elasticity of supply. In industries that are characterized mostly by economies of scale, meaning that most of the firms in this industry are experiencing economies of scale, then the supply will be more elastic. The reason for this is, again, let's think about it, an increasing price scenario. In a market with increasing prices, if the firms are experiencing economies of scale, they will want to respond to that actually very strongly, not only to capture the increase in prices, but also to be able to become more efficient. However, in an industry with more diseconomies of scale, you can see that this will go in the completely opposite direction, generating an inelastic supply curve. Finally, I want to mention the importance of the time horizon in influencing the price elasticity of supply. This idea here is the same as in what we discussed for the demand. In the short run, generally, the supply is quite price inelastic. Only in the long run, it can become more elastic. The reason for this is that over the long period of time, firms basically have more time to adjust their factors of production to perhaps to become more efficient and also to overcome the capacity constraints. I want to end this discussion by showing you the differences in the shape of supply curves with different degrees of elasticities. I have two examples here. One is an example of an elastic supply, and the other one is an example of an inelastic supply curve. Again, as in the case of demand, the elastic supply curve is the one that looks relatively more flat, and the inelastic one is the one that looks steeper. So why is the inelastic supply curve is represented by more a steep curve and the elastic one with a more flat one? Very simple thought experiments can basically show us the reason. I picked the midpoint here, mid price point here on the inelastic supply curve. It's just simple thought experiment. Let me just increase the price a little bit, say about 50%. When I increase the price here by about 50%, let's see how much the quantities are responding to it. Just a tiny little bit, right? So therefore, it is an inelastic supply curve. Let me just do the same exercise on this curve. I again pick here a price point, and then I increase the price by a similar amount. As you can see, these are roughly similar. And now let's observe the change in quantities. Under the elastic supply curve, the quantity here, the initial value, it will go all the way up, here. It's a pretty large jump. So therefore, for a given similar degree of change in the price, here we get a much more reaction. So therefore, that's why it's an elastic supply curve. Thank you.